Hi everyone, and welcome back to these talks on the treatise. I'm going to share with you the PowerPoint. So last time we left off on this particular line, which states to be faithful, filial, friendly, and fraternal. The idea of being filial to most of us would not be a new concept, particularly if you've grown up in an Asian culture or you know of your friends with Asian people, because this is something that you would have heard of or even experienced. Now, filiality is not only important in terms of Confucian culture, the Confucian canon, but as you can see here, the treatise is a foundational text of Taoism, and it also talks about this notion. Buddhism is also another tradition which is centered on this idea of filiality, in Chinese, xiao. So you could say that all three main traditions of Chinese culture throughout history have particularly paid attention to this particular concept. So the interesting thing about the treatise is it spends a lot of time talking about this particular line. So I want to explore this more today, probably from different facets compared to what Kelly has explored last week. In the collected commentary to the treatise, it also provides us with a bit of a checkup. So how do we know when we're not being filial? Most of the time, we would say that we care for our parents, but there might be some symptoms that we need to look out for. So here are what they've listed as 8 symptoms that we might have to evaluate. So first of all is what they call self-centered habits. Now, this is when, we always get our own way. We never have to accord with anyone else in our family or our parents. And, we don't have to do anything for anyone else. Everyone has to sort of follow what we say. And in that way, we can become more and more self-centered. Second thing is when we're inconsiderate and ill-mannered. And I think this is in particular relation to how we deal with our parents. What's the tone of voice that we use when we talk to our parents, for example? Third, a person has nothing to say to their parents or siblings. They're impatient with their family, and to the point of not even wanting to really have much contact with them. They'd rather have contact with their friends. So on the other hand, they might have a lot of things to talk about with their friends, but not much when it comes to their parents or other family members. Another symptom is when we feel ungrateful or even resentful towards our parents. And you can pick up on this when you see someone who they seem closer to people who they only see once in a while, or they feel really, really grateful when they get an occasional gift from their friend. But their family members or parents that they live with and have, provided them with many things, they never say thank you or feel appreciative towards their parents. The fifth is when they treat their parents' wealth and property as their own. So it's that idea of, what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine. And the idea is perhaps, when they fall short on money, they expect handouts and they don't ever think about repaying. Another symptom is when a particular person enjoys the good times with their spouse or their partner and their children, but they don't really care about their parents. So they buy things just to enjoy it with their own family rather than thinking about parents and other elders. The next symptom, so-called dissipated life, is when things like gambling, living an extravagant life, and using that money for yourself. The eighth symptom is being estranged with siblings, so fighting, competing, constantly arguing with siblings. This is also a symptom of being unfilial. So the collected commentary is quite interesting because it sort of takes from different throughout the history of China, since the Song Dynasty, when this 600 years ago, when this treatise was written, different people have provided their ideas, and it's all sort of collected in this one text, the collected commentaries. They also talked about circumstances in which one can be extremely unfilial beyond this normal context of the 8 symptoms here. So that's when one abandons their parents, when their parents are elderly, sick, they're alone, perhaps they're widowed, or poor. And that registers in the extreme context of being unfilial, because that's when our parents need us the most. It might be easy to care for our parents when they're well or wealthy, but when they particularly need our help in these circumstances, then we have to that's when we can truly care for them, genuinely care for them. So this is this idea of being extremely unfilial. And so you start to get the point that being filial is not a particular behavior. It's not saying to our parents that we love them, but actually caring for them in a holistic way. And in particular, the attitude that we put ourselves in the shoes of our parents. So as the collected commentaries continues by saying, we should never let our parents feel sad, afraid, worried, distressed, ignored, or depressed. And most of the time, you would say that they might not be worried about themselves, but they might be worried about you, or others, your siblings. They're worried about your future, what's going to happen to you, etc. And knowing that, we need to give them the confidence that we are organized, that we know what's happening in our lives, so that they don't need to worry about us. So this idea of being filial is something that's quite all-encompassing. And when I when I discuss this concept generally with people of Asian and even non-Asian backgrounds, most people generally agree that family feeling, the cherishing their family, is something that's very important in their lives. But a common response I get in terms of this notion of filiality, whether it's Taoist or Confucian or Buddhist, is that, yes, it might be easy to understand filiality when we're at home or when we're young. But what about beyond the home? What about when we are, at work? These days, it's quite competitive, whether you're at school, university, or work, and there's a million things that you have to do. At that point in time, our parents are not really at the forefront of our minds. So how is it then that, filiality remains relevant to us outside the home? In other words, how is it relevant in other facets of our lives? And I think that's a very good question. I think that's something that I'd like to explore. And I want to try to answer this question with a simple analogy. So recently, when I was, stop sharing, recently when I was at a university in Hong Kong, it coincided with their annual graduation ceremonies. And it sort of stretches across several days. And this particular day was the graduation ceremony for master's and doctorate students. There were literally hundreds of these graduates. If you can imagine, they're all in their graduation gowns. Everyone is really happy, very proud. They're taking photos with parents, with teachers, taking photos of the university. And myself, having now graduated from 4 degrees, I can, truly empathize with that feeling of, just finally getting to the end of all your studies, and being really grateful for this educational institute that has really nurtured you from the early days, your fresher days, and to finally, have that degree. So that sense of gratitude that you feel at that moment is something that I want to sort of dwell into, to delve into rather, because we are grateful to that university or our teachers, but does that mean that we always need to stay at that university and continue being a student so that we can never leave our teacher's side? Obviously not, because being grateful is actually taking the learning, the skills that we've developed through our time with our teachers, and using that to help the community, to help, develop our career in whatever organization we're part of, and even, contributing to the field if we ultimately do research. So let's now think about, come back to that idea of the family context. So when we think about filiality and caring for our parents or being grateful for what they've given us, actually, this filiality is not being beside our parents for 24 hours of the day, unless, of course, they have high-level care needs. But it's actually taking what they've taught us through our whole, upbringing, and then being able to use that to pay it forward and really help and be the best that we can in our future lives as citizens of this country, of contributors to our particular field, our particular profession. So that's the gratitude that we're talking about. That's how, even though we might be very, very busy at work, we can still practice this filiality, because it's about making the most of the opportunities we've been given through our family, our teachers, etc., and then paying it forward by doing the best that we can in our work, which is this concept of faithfulness in Chinese, 忠. Now, let's continue with this analogy. What is it that when we graduate from university, what is it that we're grateful for, right? Most times, a bachelor would be 3 years, right? And in that 3 years, our teachers impart us with very important knowledge, with skills, and in certain professions, the last few years might involve actually shadowing our teacher. Say, for example, if you're doing teaching, then you'd go and have a practicum within the school. So you're not just learning from the textbooks anymore. You're actually learning from their example. You're learning their attitude to their work and how they deal with others. So whether it's clients, patients, or students, whatever profession that you're part of. So you actually learn from both their words and example. Now, that's for 3 years after when we graduate from university. When we think about the family context, well, we're learning from our parents not just for 3 years, but actually it's a lifelong learning. And it's a very holistic form of learning. Yes, we learn our language, our first words, learned from the people who talk around us. That's how we develop our language. But we also learn life skills, knowledge, emotional intelligence, how we manage our emotions, our intellectual, cognitive, social, moral, etc., skills and knowledge all come from our carers. And for most of the time, that would be our parents and the people around us, our family members. So you can see that it's a very all-encompassing kind of education that takes place within the family. And in Chinese culture, that idea of your first few years in which you haven't entered formal education, the so-called family education, was considered very, very important, crucial to as a foundation for the rest of our lives. So it's more than just scholarship that we learn at home, obviously. And Stephen Angle, an American sinologist, expresses it really well. He says that this bond that we have with our parents, this parent-child relationship, is really one of the first relationships that we have in which love and care are prioritized over power and interest. What does that mean? It means that this love and care occurs without conditions. It's unconditional. There's no strings attached. Think, for example, if you're going on holiday. As soon as you leave the home, you have to think about, well, where do I live? Accommodation becomes a very big chunk of your travel budget. Then there's the accommodation is really just a roof over your head, but you actually then have to think of your 3 meals. So the food expenses. And then on top of that, your transport, so flights, etc., or when you get there, train, bus. And then on top of that, where you're going to go, tickets and tours. So the moment that you leave the home, every little service requires some sort of payment or reciprocation, immediate, in the sense that, and that's what Stephen Angle was talking about in this idea of power and interest, that it's through that person is only going to provide you with that service, with the meal, if you pay them or provide them with some sort of compensation. But think back to within the home. You know, before our mom cooks something for us, she doesn't think about how much you're going to pay her. Before our sibling gives us a lift to the airport, they don't think about, how much is the fare calculation. And, when you reach for something at home, you don't need to think about any sort of payment. And that's that kind of idea of unconditional sort of care, that your family, in a way, puts up with you or cares for you at your best and your worst times. Sometimes we're not in the best mood. Sometimes we're not on the best behavior, but they still have to put up with us and care for us. Why? Because we're family. And that bond, whether it's a parent-child or even sibling relationship, is characterized by this unconditional care and love. So that's what we learn when within the family. We learn that these relationships are possible. And if we're lucky enough, when we grow up, we might have really good friends or even teachers who also are able to, we can have that kind of a bond with them. And we can create that bond because we've learned it from what we've been given in the home, in that home environment. So we learn about how to trust others, how to really care for others genuinely without, strings attached. And then we bring it to other relationships in our life. So you can see, of course, that this idea of filiality doesn't just stop within the home and doesn't just stop within the parent and child relationship. So in answer to that question about, how is it that, I can use filiality in the rest of my life, the answer is simple, that we bring the attitudes, the skills, the knowledge that we've learned within the home environment through our upbringing, and we use it to benefit others in all our other relationships, particularly beyond the family. Now, that's not hard to understand, and I think that Kelly also explained this very well last week. But this week, I want to take it one step further and talk about how filiality extends not just to the parents that we have in this life that we see, but even to people that we don't know, we've never met before, our ancestors. And this is important in, you could say, the three main traditions of Chinese culture: Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. So just share with you this particular PowerPoint in which we think about this character, in Chinese, Xiao. And I'd like you to look at this character with me. So it's made up of two parts. There's a top part here and then a bottom part. And actually, the bottom part represents or is a pictograph of a child. So just like the photo here with its arms outstretched and the round circle being the head. But really it represents the younger generations, us and those, anyone in the generations to come. The top part is an abbreviated form of the character for old. And it's not just representing our parents, but in fact, all the older generations, including our ancestors. And Venerable Master sort of interprets this in a very sort of holistic sense by saying that when we see how the two parts are put together, you can tell that it's giving us this message that there's this intergenerational continuity between those who've come before us and those who come after us. Now, this sounds very abstract, this idea of a sense of oneness or unity. But we can sort of break that down. First of all, we are related to people that we haven't even met before, our ancestors. Genetically, from a scientific point of view, our DNA is actually half made up of our mum and half made up of our father. But their DNA, in turn, is then made up of 4 sets of individuals. So our grandparents, 2 sets of grandparents, really. And so if you continue further and further, then actually our DNA is made up, or who we are physically, as expressed through our DNA, is made up through the DNA of all those who've come before us, isn't it? On another level, we also inherit the cultural values of those who've come before us. So when our parents sort of raise us, they teach us certain values, but that in turn has been sort of instilled in them through their own family upbringing and so on and so forth. So culturally, we have this connection with those in the past. And then particularly if we are migrants, if our origins are not in this particular country, then the choices and decisions that our ancestors have made have led us to be in a certain country and where we find ourselves, the surroundings we find ourselves in right now. So where we are, who we are, genetically, mentally, culturally, all relate to those who've come before us. But Taoism also talks about this connectedness from another perspective. Taoism explains how our circumstances can be the result of what our ancestors have done in the past, whether they've accumulated good deeds or misdeeds. Now, if we jump to the later part of the treatise, there's a particular sentence or sentences. The first part is something that we are familiar with. It talks about how, there's a list of misdeeds that we will cover in the next section. And it says that if we happen to commit these misdeeds, then what happens is that our lifespan becomes depleted by units of 12 years or 100 days, depending on the gravity of the offense. And then obviously when this lifespan is completely depleted, then one passes away. But read on. The next sentence tells us, if there are unpunished offences at death, the misfortunes will befall on one's descendants. In other words, if I, for example, have committed the misdeeds that are greater than one lifetime of suffering, then that flows on to my descendants, and my descendants have to atone for them. It's not really difficult to understand, because if you take the example of, say, for example, I gamble away all of my family's fortunes, then clearly there's not going to be much left for my children. But on the other hand, if I was able to accumulate and earn and really sort of build up a sizable amount of fortune, then that flows on to my children and maybe grandchildren, etc. So that's from that point of view. But by the same token, if we have a deficit or a surplus in our good deeds, then that also flows on to our descendants. Now, some people might read this and say, well, does that mean then that my misfortune in this life is the result of my ancestors, and therefore I can blame my ancestors? Unfortunately, we can't do that. There are two reasons. The first is that if we blame our ancestors, or if we blame anyone, it doesn't change anything. And in fact, as we read on in the treatise, it is actually a misdeed to blame others, whether it's our ancestors, the stars, the spirits, the people around us, our parents, etc. We have to take 100% ownership of what's happening in our lives right now. And we have to realize that actually we've created the causes and conditions for us to be born into this particular lifetime in this particular family as well. So that's why we have to take full responsibility for our circumstances. The point that I want to make here, of course, is that from the Taoist perspective, we have to be grateful to our ancestors, not just for that genetic or cultural upbringing, but more importantly because of their if any little blessing that we have within this family is actually the result of our ancestors through their surplus sort of good fortune that they've given or passed on to their descendants. So that's something that is also a key element of filiality, that we have to be not only grateful for the benefits that we've received from our parents, people that we can see here and now, and then, use that to benefit those around us and outside the home, as I mentioned earlier. But actually, if we take it one step further, we've actually benefited from people who we've never met before in former generations, people in times past. And we use that, all that we've, that all our blessings in this life, to benefit those not just here and now in our community, but in the generations to come, people that we won't meet in times to come. So you can see that this filiality is much more than just saying, okay, well, it's the relationship that I have with my parents or the relationship that I have with others in the community. It's actually stretching back in time and stretching forward in time as well, to former generations and future generations. And our gratitude is the thing that ties us together. Now, I want to use that sort of student-teacher analogy again, because that helps us conceptualize it. So if you think about it, yes, we're really grateful to our teachers, but actually they represent an entire body of scholarship. So what our teachers tell us is actually, no, stop sharing here. What our teachers tell us is actually the accumulated knowledge of generations of scholars. Now, anyone who's done any research before will know, when you write an essay, you have to look up the sources, and people will cite those in the past, contemporary scholars, ancient scholars, texts that might have been written several hundred years ago, if you're looking at sinology, several thousands of years ago. And you'll realize that, everything that, all of the research that we're doing at the moment is really the very tip of a, pyramid, in the sense that you're building on top of the work of so many others. And so when we actually contribute to the field, and sort of when we're grateful to our teachers, we have to realize that actually we in fact are grateful to everyone who's come before us in that profession, in that field. And if we can contribute, then that contribution can also influence everyone that comes later, including people hundreds of years after. So it's the same concept, isn't it? That, when we think of our ancestors, we never met them, but actually we can we are connected with them, and can be connected to people in the future. It's just like, when we think of, say, for example, medicine, in terms of Western medicine, Hippocrates is considered the father of Western medicine. And this is a Greek physician, an ancient Greek physician who lived in the 5th century BCE. So, when we think about the history of, let's say, take, for example, Western medicine, then everyone that's come after him has really contributed to his legacy, and contributed to that idea of wanting to heal people, to help people. And that if we are able to contribute to the field, whatever profession that we're part of, we're actually contributing to that legacy of the forefathers of our own profession. And that's the same when we think of our families, which is which was a key emphasis in traditional education. When we look at Chinese traditional education, you'll note that sort of value on ancestors was quite commonplace and foundational. So much so that for the last 600 years of Imperial China, late Imperial China, Chinese history, every child had to learn a particular text when they were learning literacy, learning to read and write, called the 100 Surnames. In fact, there was a trilogy of primers, children's texts, that children would recite and learn in their early years. It's like the first 3 books that they read. And this was throughout all of China. So every child in China would learn these 3 books. And one of them was called the 100 Surnames, which is quite interesting, and I'd like to share with you right now. So as the name suggests, it's a sort of collection of all the different surnames in the Chinese community at that time. And it's really just a list of these surnames, but ordered in a very interesting way, such that children could recite them and read them. So I'll share with you the first few lines of that, this primer, this children's text. And as you can see from the pinyin, all of the words are capitalized. All of these characters are actually surnames. And the person who compiled them, we're not sure who, but they arranged them in such a way that there was rhyme and rhythm, so that the child reading it would find it very enjoyable, and at the same time we have it much easier to commit to memory because of that rhyme and rhythm. So as you can tell, if I read out the first 2 lines, you can see what I mean. 赵钱孙李周吴郑王冯陈楚魏蒋沈韩杨. So the Wang and the Yang rhyme, as you can tell, and then the 4/4 sort of arrangement of the characters really helps you recite it. Now, it wasn't just sort of reciting this so that they could learn how to write the names and surnames of people in the community, but it was also expected that the teachers would share stories about, very important historical figures who had this particular surname. So if you had the surname Zhao, then you would be able to learn about famous ancestors with, as part of your family. And there's a very good story about a young boy. His name is Ma Ling, and he lived in the 8th century. And unfortunately for Ma Ling, his father passed away when he was quite young, and his family fell on difficult times. And as a result, you could say that he really missed out on having being able to undertake a scholarly career. Because obviously, if you wanted to invest the time to really learn the texts and be able to partake in exams or any other sort of assessment so that you could become a fully fledged scholar, your family would need to have a certain level of financial security. Otherwise, as a young person, you need to have to work. So that was sort of the case for Ma Ling. And it's recorded in the text that around in his early 20s, he was sort of quite apathetic. So for quite a few people these days, if you're in your early 20s, you might have completed some sort of degree and you're looking forward to the beginning of your career. Now, for Ma Ling, at the age of 22, in his early 20s, he really had no career prospects and was not really not motivated to upskill at all. And so it was not really a very positive outlook. One day he finds himself reading one of the history books called the History of the Latter Han. And he's reading this biography. It's about Ma Yuan, someone who has exactly the same surname as him, so one of his ancestors. And this person, Ma Yuan, was actually a very famous general in the later Han period. So the Han dynasty in Chinese history is a very sort of golden, one of the golden ages of Chinese history. But unfortunately, it's sort of this Han dynasty was split into what we call the former and the later period because a senior official seized power and created an interregnum, so a discontinuity in the regime. And it was only later when Emperor Guangwu restored the dynasty that the later Han dynasty began. Now, Ma Yuan was a general around this time, and he very much contributed to the empire by consolidating the rule of Emperor Guangwu, who was, trying to stabilize the Han dynasty after the interregnum period. And so he's very much lauded for his contributions to the empire. And therefore, as a result, there's a biography. His biography is in this history of that period. So Ma Ling is reading about this famous general Ma Yuan, and he reads up to this particular line, which I've highlighted here. Now, I'm not going to give you the literal translation, but this is a direct quote from Ma Yuan, and he's trying to say that a young men, if they're in the military, if they're soldiers, they really should be dedicated to their service and to their responsibilities, so much so that they should be willing to die on the battlefield and they come home with their body wrapped in leather, which obviously means that they're sacrificing their lives on the battlefield for their country. So this is a direct quote from one of his ancestors. And something sort of, after reading this particular line, Ma Ling was so moved. And it's recorded in the text, in the history text, that he sort of reflects on himself and says, well, this is my ancestor. This is like, look at his great work, his contribution, and look at me now. And how can I let my ancestors honor sink to such depths. I have no prospects, I have no achievement, and what can I do? And so he is so inspired that shortly after he enlists in the army and himself becomes a very renowned general, so much so that his biography is found in the history of the Tang Dynasty, which is that period around the 7th to 8th century. So I've listed here Ma Ling at the top, and then you can see Ma Yuan actually lived 700 years before him. But because of that understanding that, this interconnectedness that we have with our ancestors, this idea that, this person shares the same surname as me, and how can they do it? And why can't I do it? And you just naturally become inspired. Now, interestingly enough, Ma Yuan and this Ma family actually originates from another famous general during the Warring States period, someone who lived in the 3rd century BC by the name of Zhao Shi. And you're probably wondering, how does the surname Zhao become the surname Ma? Right? Actually, in the first line of this history of the later Han, we see that it tells us that Ma Yuan's ancestor was Zhao Shi. And the reason why the descendants took on the name of Ma was because of Zhao Shi's contributions to his state, the state of Zhao. He was bestowed the title of Lord Ma Fu, which literally means, someone who can subdue the military horses. So someone who's very adept at military strategy and that sort of thing. So he was given that title, and as a result, his descendants took on the surname of Ma Fu, and later that was simplified to just the surname of Ma, which therefore is that family lineage. So you can see that from this very simple example, and also that idea of the 100 surnames, this interconnectedness that we have with everyone who's the former generations, right? But then let me take it to another level, that it's not just interconnectedness with that family line or that particular surname, but there's actually a more broader interconnectedness. Let me explain. If we look at a family tree, and I'm sure that many of us in primary school have drawn out our family tree. So I've got a hypothetical family tree here. At the bottom is the child. So let's just take, for example, he's got the surname of Zhao. Okay, and in this family tree, all the different people, their sort of titles are at the bottom, and their names I've only really provided their surname. Okay, just for simplicity, just think about their surname. So this is a hypothetical. The child's surname is Zhao, but his mother's surname is Qian, right? Taking the surnames from the first few lines of the 100 surnames primer. Now, if we travel back into and look at the surnames of this person's grandparents, you'll see that obviously the grandmother will have a different surname. Let's take, for example, Li. And then similarly, from the mother's side, there'll also be another surname, in this case, Swin. And so at the level of the grandparents, we're already looking at 4 different sort of families here, the Zhao, Li, Qian, and Swin families. Now, there's not enough space on this family tree, so I've only sort of looked at the sets of great-grandparents on the paternal side. So you'll see here the paternal grandfather's parents, again, another surname here, and the paternal grandmother's parents, which would be the great-grandparents of this child, again, introduces another surname. So altogether, if you think about it, this child heralds from 6 different family lineages, which is only limited to 6 because of the space on my family tree. But actually, if we continued looking at the maternal side, then there would be 8. And, if you continue going back further and further, there'd be more and more. So here, the family lineages of Zhao, Qian, Sun, Li, Zhou, Wu, right, are the first line of the 100 surnames. So imagine if this child was sitting in class and they hear about the ancestors of their own who have their surname Zhao, but then they're sitting next to a classmate who has the surname of, let's say, Li. And then they realize that actually they are connected in some way because, look, the paternal grandmother has the same surname. So in a way, the ancestors of the Li family would also be their ancestors too. And if we continue delving further into the past, you'll see that there's this amazing interconnectedness. I mean, we just look at it as a family tree, so it's one tree, but actually it's more like a web of, interconnectedness between, and this is, obviously just looking at the families within China. But you can see that this idea would be relevant to other cultures as well. So it's not just simply an interconnectedness to those in the past, sort of former generations of your own surname, but actually more broadly, an interconnectedness in space as well as time. So that's why, even in the Taoist context, this idea of filiality is not just towards our parents or ancestors, but as Livia Kohn, a very renowned Taoist researcher, has translated here from a text in the Taoist canon called The Great Precepts of Self-Observation. There's a few lines here that show you the extent or the scope of this filiality. It reads, "May I regard the parents of others like my own. May I regard the children of others like my own. May I regard the self of others more importantly than my own. May I regard the wounds and pains of others more importantly than my own." And you can only really understand this if you've worked through that whole concept of, what filiality means on a broader level. And, this echoes the words of Mencius, who also said something along the lines, treat the aged of your own family in a manner better befitting their venerable age, so caring for them, but then extend this care to the aged of other families. So you have to see them in the same way. Treat your own young in a manner befitting their tender age, and extend this to the young of other families. So this love and care is not just in one direction, only in the direction of your own family or people with your surname, but actually much more than that. And see, it sort of really branches out. It means that, this gratitude that we have for those in the past is paid forward or is spread and extended to so many others in the here and now and also in the future. Now, we've talked about this idea of filiality as being this very grand concept. And, by now you probably realize that the scope is immense on an infinite level. Well, what's really the starting point? As it says here, well, the starting point is beginning with your own family, right? And the starting point of that is being mindful of all of the sacrifices that our family has made for us, particularly our parents. And I want to hone in on one particular, in the last few minutes, hone in on one particular sort of attitude that we need to take. But that's only really one facet. And this is the attitude of gratitude. Okay, so being grateful. Gratitude itself is quite a fuzzy concept, but in fact, there have been many studies in psychology, lots of research that has honed in on this idea. And I want to share this with you, with some of these studies with you, so that you can understand that gratitude as an attitude actually has so much benefit. Okay, so in this particular example of the study, so sort of taking a step back from filiality. And just thinking about that idea of gratitude, not just for our parents, but in general. Now, this study was published in 2003, and it enrolled uh, nearly 200 participants. They split the participants into 3 groups. One group would list out their blessings, so things that they were grateful for. Another group was assigned to only think about the negative things in their life, the hassles, which we'll go into, which we'll define later. And then another group was asked to focus on neutral things, like, what's just happened in your life. And then they were surveyed on their ideas of gratitude. So are they feeling grateful, appreciative, thankful of things in their life, but not really anything specific, just that attitude. And they were given scores, or they scored themselves. And this was, they also rated their well-being in terms of mood, symptoms of physical illness, like shortness of breath, tiredness, etc., how they felt when they received support, how long they exercised per week, as well as global life appraisal. And they did this weekly for 9 weeks. So that's over 2 months. What was the instructions first? I guess it's important to sort of discuss the methodology. So in terms of gratitude, they were asked to focus on things, large and small, that they might be grateful about. So this is that group that had to focus on their blessings. And then write down 5. And this was just once a week. And, people would write about, grateful for their parents, someone helped them out, good weather, just anything. The people that had to focus on the negatives were told to think about things that annoyed them or bothered them. Could be anything, their relationship, work, school, etc. And then list 5 as well. And, people would talk about, maybe bad drivers, getting a bad test result, someone who's really annoying them, or, again, bad weather or something like that. And then the neutral group were told just to think about things that they did. So clean my room. There's no sort of negative or positive emotion related to that, or, I took a flight. And then they had to list that. So what were the results? Well, those who listed their blessings were found to feel better about their lives as a whole. So this global sort of well-being. And then they were more optimistic about the week ahead, because they were asked to score how they feel about the week ahead. They also experience fewer symptoms of any physical illness, for example, headaches, tiredness, fatigue, shortness of breath, those sorts of things. And it was found that on average, this group exercised more by 1.5 hours a week. So you can see that on a mental and a physical level, there were benefits compared to the control group, so the group that was just looking at neutral things in their life events, and compared to even compared to the negative group, obviously. But these investigators, these 2 professors, felt that it wasn't enough. In this particular study, they also talked about another study that was more intensive. So in the second study, there were nearly 160 participants. Again, 3 conditions, blessings, hassles, or more neutral kind of group. They were asked to score their levels of gratitude and well-being, but they did it daily instead of weekly. And they did it this time because it was daily, more intensive. It was only over a 2-week period compared to the 2 months of the previous study. But the result was actually quite astounding, that these participants, the ones who counted their blessings, focused on what they were grateful for, reported higher levels of positive affect. And on top of that, because they felt that, they were, I guess, being being the beneficiary of other people's support and care, they also engaged voluntarily in what we call pro-social behavior, which is they actually reached out to others and helped others as well, and did so happily, willingly. And that's that idea of paying it forward, that, other people care for you, and then you use that to generally care for others. this gratitude, this study, there's been countless studies of gratitude. There's another one, not in any specific, so this was not in any specific relationship, but there's another one just published this year, which looked at how couples, the relationship that between couples in terms of gratitude. So they enlisted 316 couples, and these couples averaged, if they were married, they'd been together for 10 years, 10 or so years. And they were asked or surveyed about how they expressed gratitude, if they felt that they showed appreciation for their partner. And then another sense of gratitude that they tested was perceived gratitude. So how much they thought that their partner appreciated them. Okay, so the two types of gratitude. And then how they felt in terms of their relationship, were they satisfied, how much they argued, etc., and even levels of financial strain. And they were followed for 15 months, so over a year. And the result was that those with higher levels of expressed, so they're saying thank you, they're being appreciative, and also they feel appreciated, these people had much more, unsurprisingly, more satisfaction in their relationship, greater confidence in that relationship, more commitment, and less feelings of, is there going to be some sort of changes in this relationship, breakup, etc. So they felt more, you could say, a sense of mental well-being related to that relationship and happiness. And this idea of gratitude, as I said before, does seem quite fuzzy, but really, if you boil it down, and what these investigators have defined as gratitude is the idea that, the things that we value in our life, things of value, we realize that the source of that goodness, or that it's not completely our own, you could say, it's not something that is completely our own work and effort, but actually the source of what we treasure in our life, whether it be, our skills, our knowledge, are partly to do with the contributions of others. And because we acknowledge and recognize the contributions of others, we feel grateful and appreciative of that. And then that leads to feelings of reciprocating, wanting to care for that person, and then also bringing that gratitude to other areas of our life. So really, in terms of this idea of filiality, you can see that even if we just hone in on one aspect of filiality, which is being grateful, being grateful for that first relationship that you have in life, that relationship where your parents have provided you physically, emotionally, socially, cognitively, etc. And then because we develop that skill of just being appreciative and grateful, then you can take it to other aspects of your life. There's actually been studies in the workplace where employers who've showed gratitude to their staff, that's resulted in better productivity in the work environment. So all our relationships can use these skills that we develop within the home. And that's, that greater aspect of filiality, that it's not just me and my mum and dad, our parents, but actually even stretching before them, being grateful for what we have because of the result of our ancestors. And that when we think about our ancestors, it's not just those with our surname, but actually many, many others. And then you feel connected with others in the community, people around you, but also you're connected and you feel a sense of responsibility to continue that legacy for those to come, to be grateful for the benefits and then benefit those in the future. So leave you with that thought of this widened scope of filiality, and then that idea of putting it into practice with a very simple notion of gratitude in your life. in all aspects of your life. So thank you very much and look forward to seeing you next week.